I used to think the biggest marriage mistake was something obvious, an affair, a betrayal, a single moment you could point to and say, that's when everything broke. I don't think that anymore. The mistake I didn't notice for years was quieter. It was believing that keeping the peace was the same thing as protecting the marriage. I remember a Tuesday morning, years into it. The house was still dark, the kitchen light buzzing like it always did. Coffee sat on the warmer too long and picked up that burned metal taste. She was asleep down the hall. I stood there alone, staring at the sink, already rehearsing my day before it had started. On the counter was a folded note I'd written the night before, not a love note, a reminder. Talk tonight. I'd written it because I knew I wouldn't remember otherwise, because I'd learned that if I didn't schedule honesty, it didn't happen. That was my first quiet accommodation, and I treated it like organization instead of warning. We were good at being functional. Bills paid on time, holidays planned, photos taken where we both smiled the way we were supposed to. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. Inside the house, nothing felt urgent enough to name, but somewhere along the way, I started editing myself. Not lying, just trimming. Leaving things out because they felt inconvenient. Swallowing small frustrations because they didn't seem worth the tension they might create. I told myself I was being mature, that this was what long marriages required. Compromise, patience, restraint. I believed that if I could manage my reactions, everything else would stay intact. The truth was simpler and harder. I was avoiding discomfort, and she was doing the same. I remember sitting across from her at the dinner table one night, plates untouched, television murmuring in the background. She asked how my day was, and I gave her the safe version. She nodded. I nodded back. We both knew there was more, and we both let it pass, as if silence were a shared agreement. That became our rhythm. Not arguing, not resolving, just moving past things quickly enough that they never demanded attention. Years can pass like that, quietly, without arguments, without doors slamming, without anything dramatic enough to demand intervention. That's why the mistake goes unnoticed. You don't feel like you're losing something, you feel like you're maintaining it. What I didn't see then was the cost. Every time I stayed quiet to keep the peace, I put a little more distance between us. Not all at once, just enough that neither of us noticed the space growing. Conversation shortened, curiosity faded, silence became familiar. By the time I finally noticed what was missing, it felt normal. And that normality is the most dangerous part of all, because once distance feels ordinary, you stop questioning it. You start calling it stability. And that's how the mistake survives for years without ever being named. After that Tuesday morning, I carried the note in my head all day. Talk tonight. It sounded simple until the hours started piling up. By late afternoon, the conversation felt heavier than it had that morning, like it gained weight just from being postponed. When I pulled into the driveway, her car was already there. The porch light was on, and I could see her in the kitchen window, moving from counter to sink in that efficient way she had when she was tired. I remember thinking, not now, not when she's already spent, not when I'm wrung out. I told myself I was being considerate, but what I was really doing was bargaining with discomfort. Dinner was ordinary. We talked about groceries, a neighbor's remodel, a dentist appointment we both needed to make. There were moments where the air opened up like a door left ajar, and I could have stepped through with the real thing. Each time, I chose the safer subject, the one that didn't change anyone's expression. At one point, she reached across the table and wiped a spot of sauce off my chin with her thumb. It was such a familiar gesture that it almost made me brave. I felt something rise in my throat, the start of what I meant to say, and then I swallowed it because the television was loud and the dishes were waiting, and I didn't want to turn a Tuesday into a talk. Later, we stood in the hallway brushing our teeth side by side. The mirror fogged, and she looked at me through the haze and asked, "You okay?" I said yes too quickly. She gave a small nod like she'd heard that answer before and went to bed. I stayed up pretending to finish work. The laptop glow lit my hands and the edge of the couch. I opened emails I didn't need to answer and typed responses I never sent. What I was really doing was avoiding the quiet because quiet makes room for truth. Sometime after midnight, I turned off the lights and walked past the note on the counter. It was still there, folded the way I'd left it. And I remember feeling irritated at a piece of paper, as if it were the one pressuring me. I tucked it into a drawer. Out of sight, out of mind, like that was a solution. That was the pattern I didn't recognize. I thought I was choosing harmony, but I was choosing delay. And delay is gentle at first. It doesn't look like damage. It looks like being busy, being tired, being practical. The cost didn't show up as a fight. It showed up as fewer questions, shorter replies, a little less laughter at the same jokes. The marriage didn't crack in one place. It slowly dried out, the way a plant does when you keep meaning to water it tomorrow. The thing about small distances is that you can explain them away. You tell yourself it's work, stress, parenting, the season you're in. You can put a reasonable label on anything and feel responsible while you do it. A few months after that, we went to a birthday dinner for friends we'd known since our 20s. They were the kind of couple who still touched each other when they talked. A hand on a shoulder, a palm on a back. Nothing showy, just present. We slid into a booth across from them, and I remember the vinyl sticking to the back of my legs. The restaurant was loud, all clatter and laughter. The husband told a story about getting lost on a road trip, and his wife corrected him gently, smiling while she did it. When she laughed, he laughed with her, not at her. It was such a small thing, but it hit me like a sudden draft. I realized I couldn't remember the last time my wife and I had laughed like that. The kind where your chest loosens. On the drive home, the streetlights flashed across her face like a slow metronome. She stared out the passenger window, quiet, and I wanted to ask what she was thinking. I didn't. I didn't want to open something I couldn't neatly close before bed. At a red light, she said, "They seem happy." Her voice wasn't bitter. It was flat, like she was stating the weather. I said, "Yeah, they do." And then I added something about how everyone looks good in public. I meant it as realism. It landed like dismissal. She turned her head and looked at me, not angry, not pleading, just tired. "Do you ever feel like we're just, managing?" she asked. That was a doorway. I felt it. I knew that if I stepped through, we might finally speak in a way we hadn't in years. Instead, I did what I'd gotten good at. I smiled a little, kept my tone light, and said, We're fine. We're just busy." Her shoulders dropped in a way that made me feel like I'd watched something small fall to the floor. She nodded, and the conversation ended right there, clean and painless on the surface. The rest of the drive was filled with radio and the soft hum of tires. That night, she went to bed early. I stayed up and watched an episode of something I didn't care about, just to avoid lying in the dark with the question she'd asked. The next morning, we moved on as if it hadn't happened. And that's how I learned the real danger. You can survive a long time on fine, while connection quietly starves. It wasn't one big blow up that finally forced us to look at it. It was a middle of the week emergency that changed the temperature of our lives for a week. Her father ended up in the hospital after a fall. Nothing dramatic on the phone, just the words, "He's stable," and "They're keeping him overnight." We drove there in the dark, the car full of that stiff silence you get when you're trying to be strong. In the lobby, the air smelled like disinfectant and coffee that had been reheated too many times. We sat in a waiting room with plastic chairs and a muted television. People around us spoke in low voices, the way strangers do when grief is nearby. My wife stared at the double doors that led to the hall, and I watched her hands twist a tissue into a rope. I wanted to say, "I'm here." I wanted to ask what she was afraid of, but my old habit rose up like it always did. Don't make it worse. Don't ask the wrong thing. Don't bring emotion into a space already full of it. So I handled logistics. I checked in with the nurse. I texted her brother. I looked up visiting hours. I tried to be useful enough that no one would notice how clumsy I felt at comfort. At one point, she leaned her head against my shoulder. It surprised me, not because she didn't love me, but because it had been so long since she reached for me without explanation. Her hair smelled like shampoo in the cold night air. I froze for a second, then put my arm around her, and I realized I didn't know what to do with tenderness anymore. I knew how to solve problems. I didn't know how to stay present inside them. Later, when a doctor finally came out, he spoke quickly in phrases that sounded rehearsed. Fracture, observation, discharge plan. My wife nodded like she understood, but as soon as he walked away, she whispered, "I can't do this alone." It wasn't a complaint, it was a confession. Something in me loosened. I heard myself say, "You're not alone, and I'm sorry I've acted like you are." The words surprised me as much as they surprised her. She looked at me, eyes wet, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then she said, "I miss us." And that sentence landed harder than anything we'd avoided at home. We stayed there until morning, and in that bright hospital light, we finally talked like two people on the same side. Not perfectly, but honestly. And I saw with painful clarity how many chances I'd let pass because peace felt safer than connection. The week after the hospital, the house felt different. Not warmer exactly, but less sealed. We spoke more, even about small things, and I kept waiting for the old silence to slide back into place like a door that closes on its own. On Sunday afternoon, we sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad between us. No candle, no music, no romance to soften it. Just sunlight on the linoleum and the sound of the dishwasher finishing a cycle. She drew a line down the page and wrote, "What we avoid on one side and what we want on the other." I laughed, a nervous little laugh, and said, "Are we doing a business meeting?" My stomach tightened. She didn't smile. "If we don't treat this like something real," she said, "we'll keep treating it like something that can wait." That sentence stung because it was true. We started listing things, and the list surprised me. Not because the problems were huge, but because they were consistent. My habit of disappearing into work when I felt stressed, her habit of shutting down when she felt criticized, the way we both saved our strongest words for strangers and gave each other summaries. Halfway down the page, she stopped and looked at me. "Do you know what it feels like," she said, "to live with someone who's always trying to keep things smooth?" I started to defend myself. I could feel the argument forming, the old reflex. I'm trying, I'm providing, I'm not a bad man. But the hospital had taught me something. Defending my intent didn't change her experience. So I asked, "What does it feel like?" She took a long breath. "It feels like I'm alone in the important moments," she said. "Like I'm married to a person who's present for the schedule, but absent for the truth." That was hard to hear. It was also clean. It told me exactly what my politeness had cost. I told her about the drawer with that paper, how I'd made honesty into a task and then avoided the task. I told her I'd been afraid that one wrong conversation could ruin everything. And I realized as I said it out loud how backwards that was. Avoiding the conversation had been the thing doing the ruining. We didn't fix the marriage that afternoon, but we did something we hadn't done in years. We stayed in the discomfort long enough to learn something from it. And for the first time, I understood the mistake clearly. Peace without truth doesn't protect love, it slowly replaces it. 2 weeks after the hospital, I tried to repair us the way I'd repaired everything else in my life with small systems. I moved meetings. I started coming home earlier and acting like the earlier arrival itself was proof that I was different. One morning, the sun was just starting to rinse the kitchen walls, and my laptop was already open. I had our calendar on the screen with a block I'd labeled Us. 30 minutes, no phones. I stared at it and felt a strange pride, the kind you feel when a plan looks responsible. That afternoon, I tested it in the safest place I could think of, a grocery store aisle. Fluorescent lights, carts squeaking, nothing sacred. She was comparing 2 jars of pasta sauce, and I said, "I've been thinking about what you wrote." My voice came out careful, like I was trying not to spill something. I slipped into my old habit without noticing. Instead of telling her what I felt, I started presenting reasons. Stress, pressure, the way I'd learned early on to go quiet when a room got tense. I could hear myself building a case as if love were a courtroom and I was trying to be found innocent. She put the jar back and looked at me with that exhausted steadiness that has nothing to do with anger. "Do you notice you're explaining again?" she asked. "It's like you're trying to make it acceptable instead of making it true." We finished shopping with polite silence, the kind that passes for normal in public. At the checkout, the cashier joked about the weather. We laughed at the right time. In the parking lot, the sun hit the windshields and turned everything the color of coins. I stood at the trunk with bags in my hands and realized what I was really protecting. I wasn't protecting her from discomfort. I was protecting myself from being seen as the one who'd caused it. That night, I tried again, but I didn't bring a speech. We sat on the couch with the television off, and the quiet felt heavier than any argument. I told her simply that I was scared of being wrong. Not wrong about a detail, wrong about who I'd been in our marriage. I told her I'd confused calm with closeness and that I'd been using fine as a shield. She didn't rush to reassure me. She just said, when you go silent, I start living like you're already gone." It wasn't dramatic, it was plain. We didn't have a clean breakthrough. We had an uneven conversation with long pauses and a few moments where I almost tried to smooth it over with a joke, but I stayed in it. When we finally went to bed, nothing was solved, but the quiet no longer belonged to my avoidance. It belonged to the two of us sharing the same room, awake to what was real. The next test didn't come in a planned conversation at the table. It came on a Thursday night when nothing was wrong enough to feel urgent. We'd both had long days. She came in carrying her purse like a weight and started talking about a coworker's mess, half complaint, half disbelief. I listened, nodded in the right places, and felt the familiar urge to fix the mood, to steer us toward something lighter before the evening turned sharp. That was my old move, smooth the surface and call it closeness. Instead, I asked, "What did that bring up for you?" It was a simple question, but it changed the room. She stopped mid-sentence and looked at me like she was deciding if I meant it. After dinner, we walked, the kind of walk we used to take before everything felt scheduled. The neighborhood was quiet, porch lights coming on one by one. Our steps stayed in sync for a while, then drifted, then found each other again. Halfway down the block, she said, "I don't know how to trust that you won't vanish the next time things get uncomfortable." She didn't say it to accuse me. She said it like someone naming weather, something you have to plan around. That my first instinct was to promise, to announce a new version of myself and hope the announcement did the work. But I knew what that sounded like, so I told her what I'd been doing when I went quiet, how I'd been running ahead in my head, rehearsing consequences, trying to prevent a scene that didn't exist yet. I admitted that I'd treated tension like an alarm, something to silence immediately. I admitted that I'd been more committed to appearing steady than to being fully present. We reached a corner where the street opens up and you can see the whole stretch of road. She stopped under a streetlight and crossed her arms. It felt like I had to become easy, she said, like the honest version of me was too much. That sentence had nowhere to hide. I didn't argue with it. I didn't explain my intent. I just said, "I'm sorry I taught you that." The words came out plain, not theatrical, but true. A car passed, headlights sweeping over us and then gone. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath. On the way back, she reached for my hand. It wasn't a reward, it was a cautious offering, and it asked something of me. Stay. When we got home, we didn't fill the night with noise. We sat at the table and talked about small things that had become heavy over time, not in speeches, in short, honest sentences. And I realized the shift wasn't learning perfect communication. It was learning not to leave the moment when the truth finally arrived. A month later, the change didn't look like romance. It looked like a Tuesday morning done differently. I woke before her, as I usually did, and stood in the kitchen while the coffee brewed. The house was quiet, not the strained quiet we used to live inside, but the ordinary kind that comes before the day starts. On the counter sat a small notebook she'd left open, a page filled with her handwriting. Not a list of problems this time, just a few sentences about what helped her feel close, being asked questions, being touched without an agenda, not being rushed toward fine. I didn't treat it like instructions, I treated it like a window. When she came in, hair messy, sweatshirt pulled over her hands, I didn't greet her with a schedule. I asked, "How did you sleep?" And then I waited for the real answer. She blinked at me, surprised by the waiting, and said, "Not great." In the past, I would have filled that with solutions. Instead, I said, "Do you want to talk about what kept you up?" And I let the silence do its work. She told me about a worry she'd been carrying for weeks, something she hadn't wanted to burden me with. While she talked, I noticed the urge in myself to tidy it, to reduce it to something manageable. I let the urge pass. I stayed with her words the way you stay with someone on a dark road, steady, not steering. Later that day, I caught myself drifting into old patterns. A tense email came in, and my body wanted to retreat into work and armor up. I closed the laptop, stood up, and walked to where she was folding laundry. "I'm getting pulled away," I said. "I don't want to disappear." It felt awkward, like learning a new language at my age, but it was honest. She looked at me and nodded once, as if the sentence mattered more than any grand gesture. That night, we sat on the porch with 2 mugs and no television noise behind us. A neighbor's dog barked, then stopped. The air was cool enough to make you aware of your skin. She said, "I'm still scared sometimes." I didn't argue with the fear. I didn't ask her to trust faster. I said, "I understand. I'm here anyway." I don't tell this story because we achieved a perfect marriage. We didn't. What changed was smaller and more durable. I stopped treating calm as the goal. I started treating presence as the promise. And when you do that long enough, you notice something quietly miraculous. The room between two people doesn't have to be filled with performance. It can be filled with truth, spoken slowly, while both of you remain.